Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, most gracious, ever merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace to everyone. Good evening to those of you who are logged in from across America. Some of you are logged in from abroad as well. I know it's late out there in Europe. Thank you so much for joining this evening. We're very grateful for your time. On behalf of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the United States, I welcome you virtually to part 2 of our special series entitled Supreme Justice. As I mentioned at the outset of our first program last month, the term Supreme Justice is grounded in core Islamic teachings that speak about the importance of absolute justice in all matters. The international spiritual leader of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, His Holiness, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, has emphasized the vital importance of working to achieve supreme justice at all levels of society. I just want to, at the outset here, share 2 quotes from His Holiness that really form the framework for this virtual program. So His Holiness has spoken about supreme justice at all levels. He says that the Quran makes clear that all people are born equal. In the final sermon ever delivered by the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, he instructed all Muslims to always remember that an Arab is not superior to a non-Arab, nor is a non-Arab superior to an Arab. And he taught that a white person is not superior to a black person, nor is a black person superior to a white person. Thus, it is a clear teaching of Islam that the people of all nationalities and all races are equal. He further says that if we truly want peace in our time, then we must act with justice. We must value equality and fairness. As the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, so beautifully stated, we must love for others what we love for ourselves. We must pursue the rights of others with the same zeal and determination that we pursue our own rights. We should broaden our horizons and look at what is right for the world rather than what is only right for us. These are the means for peace in our age. So in part 1 of our series last month, we explored the question, what now? Today, we funnel our discussion into a topic that is, of course, on our minds for many years, and that is the state of policing in America. What we all observed on Memorial Day when George Floyd was murdered was a grave violation of the sanctity of human life. A member of law enforcement abused his power to mercilessly place his knee on the neck of an unarmed black man and refused to remove it for almost 9 minutes, even as the victim repeated, "I can't breathe." Now, this was not the first time this has happened, and the horrific incident left many of us asking, how can we restore supreme justice in our policing? So I was thinking as a way to frame today's discussion that it might be helpful to share some data that our team gathered from several recent studies about the state of race and policing. So here we quantify the injustice, if you will. There are several recent studies that some of you may be familiar with, but I share these as a way to frame the conversation. Mapping police violence indicates that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. Yale Law School reports that it's 21% more likely for a Black person to endure police force, excessive force. Stanford's Open Policing Project says that it's 20% more likely for a Black person to be pulled over by the police. The Pew Research Center has several important findings of late. 87% of Black Americans and 61% of white Americans say that the criminal justice system treats Black people unfairly. 66% of Americans say that we need more power to sue police officers. Interestingly, there's a report and a survey that 73% of Americans say that we should keep or increase the police budget. So These statistics, hopefully you keep these in mind, and I'm sure this will be discussed from our panelists, but we wanted to provide that as a backdrop. I'm once again joined by my friend and colleague, my co-moderator for this evening, Mahershala Ali. Mahershala, welcome. He's going to help me shortly moderate this program. We have quite a panel, Mahershala, today. We have Dr. Tricia Rose, who is a sociologist and scholar and serves as a professor of Africana Studies and director for the study of race and ethnicity at Brown University. She specializes in 20th century African-American culture and politics, social thought and gender issues, popular culture as well. Welcome to the program, Dr. Rose.
My pleasure. Thank you all so much for having me.
We also are joined by Dr. Cornel West, who is a prominent intellectual and professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University, also professor emeritus at Princeton University. He's the author of 20 books, including his two classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters. Dr. Cornel West, there was a storm in New Jersey and he's lost power, but he still braved it and is able to hear us. Dr. West, welcome to the program.
Oh, I am so deeply blessed to be a part of this distinguished panel and wonderful dialogue.
Thank you. And we have Chief Carmen Best. She's the police chief for the city of Seattle since 2018. She's been with the Seattle Police Department for 28 years. She holds a Master's of Science in Criminal Justice from Northeastern University, chair of the Human and Civil Rights Committee for the International Association for the Chiefs of Police, and a member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Welcome, Chief Best.
Good afternoon or evening, depending upon where you are, but thank you. So excited to be a part of this very distinguished panel, very exciting.
Great, we have Professor Seth Stoughton, who is Associate Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina Law School. He studies policing and how it is regulated. He's published in a number of top journals. He's just co-authored a book, Evaluating Police Uses of Force. He previously served as an officer with the Tallahassee Police Department in Florida for 5 years. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia Law School and formerly a lecturer at Harvard Law School. Welcome, Professor Stoughton.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be included here.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mahershala. Let's get started. Please take it over.
Thank you, Amjad, for the introduction. Hello and peace to everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I guess how I would like to start would again be in some ways framing the conversation and sort of putting it into context a bit. And I think it's very difficult to speak about policing in our country if we don't have a broader view of a larger issue. And so I wanted to start with Dr. Rose and sort of ask you to set the stage for us a bit in speaking about what you've used the term discrimination systems, and sort of share a little bit about these concentric circles, this ecosystem that fits together to sort of shape our world and the experience that we are born into as people of color. So when you speak about housing, wealth, education, criminal justice, can you kind of like frame this world for us a bit and speak it and in how that connects or acts out in these forms that are in nature discriminatory in a certain way? Sure.
I'll try to tackle it as quickly as possible.
Take your time, but I know, but I kind of need that.
Yeah, you need some context. Without a doubt, you're absolutely right. That's a great place to start. And the reason it's important to think about the whole ecosystem, as you called it, is because when we think about issues of police violence or police brutality or police harassment in isolation, we miss the important interconnections, which help explain why so many police forces and individual police people are involved in these kinds of acts. What is the role of the police, right, in a broad sense, on the ground, and not just what we've been told the police are for. So some of that's about the historical use for the police, and I'm going to talk specifically about communities of color in relationship to dominant white societies and communities, which the police have been instrumental in sort of protecting and monitoring segregation over the course of much of, post-emancipation America. And that job was one to reinforce racial hierarchy and also sustain a culture of fear and marginality among marginal people. Now, I would say that individual police didn't make this up. They were sort of, conscripted to be the front line of a particular of enforcement of a racial hierarchy. But that racial hierarchy was also an economic hierarchy. It's also about ensuring that segregation without signs can function in a way that creates a sense of freedom, of motion, and comfort, and lack of confrontation with the violence of racial inequality and discrimination. And so as time moves forward, you begin to see that general culture of sort of policing segregation into a process by which post-civil rights era activists and all the work they did to undermine the logic and economics of segregation, the police begin to be recruited as a frontline force again to enable and expand the general criminalization of immigrants and people of color and Black people. And so this broader criminalization where laws begin to change about what constitutes criminal activity, the sentencing begins to escalate for relatively minor infractions. And after the 1980s in particular, you begin to see what people dubbed the mass incarceration system. And that becomes an economic engine as well as a social engine and a way to really mask what has been also an economic and racial crisis. But policing is extremely important. This is the last thing I'll say, and then we can come back to whatever you'd like later. Policing must be understood in the context of a broader sort of construction of fear and criminalization of Black and brown bodies. It can't simply be understood as, one bad apple, one cop, one bad system, because it's a much bigger sort of, unconscious as well as conscious infrastructure that drives this process. And what we're seeing is everything's coming to a head, partly because of technology, partly because of that expansion, really creating a kind of renegade system, unregulated system, where violence is not being handled and prevented. And so the escalation of that system has really brought us to where we are today. But it has its roots in sustaining racial hierarchies in society.
So what are some examples of just like normalized discrimination?
Yeah. Well, so for example,
like what is it that
in police,
a nice person living in a suburb somewhere who doesn't think they have a racist bone in their body, right. What are ways in which how are people participating in the oppression of a
right. Right. Well,
whether consciously or unconsciously.
Right. Well, there are many different ways, but let's start with your example of someone in a nice sort of predominantly white suburb. When we think about how segregated our housing is in the United States, we think that's just sort of a racial choice. Well, I'm white, I like to live around whites, or I'm brown, I like to live around brown people. That's actually not what has driven most of this the constant segregation that we're looking at. It's been financed by the federal government. It's been financed by local municipalities and financed by banking discrimination, so that property that is in neighborhoods that is all white or almost all white is evaluated at higher rates, no matter class position. Bank loans are less expensive for those communities, and their property values rise over time exponentially. Is a huge level of data showing that racial gap. What that means now is that you're offloading and concentrating disadvantage in working class people of color communities, because you're charging higher rates for bank lending, you're lowering the appreciation value, and which increases concentration and also concentrates economic discrimination, leaves a much more frayed safety net. So now you have basically not only racial segregation, but you have class friction that is the result partially of that racial economy. So now what's the role of the police? The role of the police is to maintain a boundary around this much more fragile, much more economically and socially a challenged community, to make sure it doesn't infect what has been a privileged and isolated form of community advantage and privilege. And so the process of wanting to hold on to that privilege, which is not always thought of in racial terms, is something that the police become an important role in doing. So, for example, it's not only that communities of color get policed excessively, it's also that predominantly middle-class white communities are never policed in certain ways. So as I've said to my students many times when I teach issues related to this, I'll say, okay, we're in a classroom, we have 150 kids. How many people are of color? And so we sort of settle them aside, and the vast majority are white. And I asked them, and I said, okay, so if I brought in some cops with dogs, would they find personal use, drugs on you? And what would happen? And of course they're panicked because they're not really sure what's going to happen. But I tell them, okay, when was the last time you had police pull you over, stop you, talk to you for anything? And the answer is almost all the time, never. Now you ask any person of color under 21, certainly over 21 too, but under 21, and all the hands pretty much shoot up, in the air. So what you're looking at is a targeting of young people who are not necessarily doing anything differently than other groups of people. So you create freedom of personal use, a decriminalized association with personal use, right, of say drugs, and a hyper criminalization of personal use in non-white communities. So the police become part of the regulation of who has more freedom, more opportunity to make mistakes or to be involved and be just a regular teenager, so on and so forth. Now that, of course, gets extended through the criminal justice system elsewhere. Now, the wheels of interaction that you were talking about are important here, because when people get fed into the system, and we have other experts here who know these details better than I do, but when they get fed into the criminal justice system, what are your resources for a safety net? Who can afford bail? Where does that bail come from? Where does that extra resource come from? Well, it usually comes from home equity, lines of credit or loans, or assets that have been able to accrue because of these other privileges before. So the police are part of a process that is regulating advantages and hierarchies across the board. But they're a critical piece of the puzzle. Just one more thing, it can also work in another direction, which is, mental health crises and other kinds of dependencies that people might have and need help for. Where are those resources, right? In communities of color, they're far rarer to come across. And so people have to fund them themselves. Those communities don't have those extra resources. They don't have public resources either. And so they become part of a criminalized culture. So it's not just about the police by themselves. Your question is really, really wonderful, because it immediately embeds all of the actions about the police inside of a broader system in society.
Thank you. It's connected to this other idea. I found myself sort of meditating on stereotypes quite a bit, and it kind of just led me down this line of thinking, and just in really getting this conversation going, I found myself having a difficult time locating like where to really start and address some of these issues that all just seem to be interconnected. And what came up for me as well, and I'll ask this question to Dr. West, was the relationship between the Black community, the Black and Brown community, and with police has been one where police officers are essentially viewed as a conduit or a bridge to prison. And so where do you, and it kind of led me to thinking about school and the education system, and just this idea that has been not floated, but investigated and spoken about at length, about schools being a pipeline essentially for prison. And I would love if Dr. West, if you could speak a little bit about that, because if your education system, especially a public system, isn't preparing you for a life and an experience toward upward mobility, and one that feeds you into either a vocation or higher education, then what is it feeding you into? And so perhaps you could speak to that a little bit, Dr. West.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to begin by saluting you, my brother.
Thank you.
Probably one of the grandest dramatic artists of your generation. And I think it's no accident, really, that Muslims, like the two freest black men in the 20th century were Muslims, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. There's something about the ways in which to be a truth teller at a deep level in a society that has been predicated so much on not just lies, but innocence, that they have to make that break. And I say that as a Christian, so, we might have theological differences, but the love cuts so much deeper, and the connection is real. And I think this issue of policing takes us back to the multi-layered context that my very dear sister and distinguished colleague and deep comrade, Professor Tricia Rose, began to lay out. We get a chance to follow through on this on the Tightrope, our podcast that we have. I just learned so much from her. But I think this notion of innocence, though, brother, is very important. Very important. America is the only modern nation to move from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity. Every civilization, every empire, every nation state we know is founded on some form of barbarism. You can't find one that's not. But what is distinctive about us is that somehow we think that as Americans, we can be the authorizers of devastation and still be innocent. That's the language of the great James Baldwin. So the innocence itself is a crime before you even engage in the particular act. And so our dominant myth is that of the frontier, which is the distinction between the civilized and the so-called barbaric. And you get more regeneration through the expansion of civilization by killing, murdering, dispossession land, engaging in genocidal attacks of indigenous peoples. So with the enslavement of Africans, the exploitation of white brothers and sisters with no property who couldn't vote until the age of Andrew Jackson, the subordination of women, the domination and degradation of women. We've got domestic violence, levels of domestic violence that have been out of control for centuries, continues to this day. So that our relation to violence and innocence is a very, very complicated but crucial one. State of California has roughly the same population as Canada. More Californians kill each other with knives than Canadians kill each other with anything. That's how violent our culture is, based on this sense of being able to engage in brutality and barbarity and still view oneself as innocent, never taking responsibility. Do it with impunity, no accountability. So then when we zero in on the specific forms of violence over time related to Black people, slavery, the neo-slavery, which was American terrorism, which was American lynching, which is Jim Crow, which is Jane Crow, to the new Jim Crow and Jane Crow Jr., 65 up into the present. The raw violence coming at Black people, and hardly anybody, including the police when they do it, having to be accountable. Always innocent. So the violence and the innocent go hand in hand, and those who are the victims of the violence have to shed the tears, attend the funerals, somehow muster their courage to keep going. Now, thank God, we've got wonderful folk like the chief justice here, who we'll be hearing from soon, who has the courage to go right into that system and say, look, there's got to be some accountability. And I'll say this last thing and stop, because I want to go back to the where I started with what it means to be a Muslim and a Christian or Jew or Buddhist or a decent human being. The priority of the moral, to say integrity, honesty, decency ought to be at the center of it. Not using innocence as a way of authorizing violence and more violence. Lack of responsibility and authorizing brutality and more brutality. Just the primacy of the moral. Integrity, honesty, decency, and then the centrality of spirituality. And by spirituality, I mean genuine empathy with those who are victimized. The empathy with those who are wrestling with the damages of violence. And the imagination, which is to authorize an alternative reality from the reality in which we live, to be able to conceive of a world that's better, conceive of relations that's better, conceive of ways of being in the world that's more loving, that's more empathetic, that is more compassionate, more kind, more sweet, more gentle. That's the spirit, to whatever form one spirituality takes. Empathy and imagination at the center. Morality, integrity, honesty, decency at the center. And the history of white supremacy in relation to indigenous peoples, in relation to brown peoples, Mexican peoples, Spanish-speaking peoples from South America, Caribbean, and especially Black folk, not because our suffering deserves any more attention than anybody else's, but because Black people have been more at the center of the imagination of America. That's what the Civil War was about. That's what the Civil Rights Movement's about. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. That our doings and sufferings have been more at the center of the public imagination of the country, as opposed to indigenous people or precious browns or precious Asians or so forth and so on, white poor or what have you. So that this issue of innocence, impunity, lack of accountability goes all the way up to the present. And then the subtle, sophisticated analysis that we heard from Professor Rose is, I think, linked to this in a way that tries to fortify each and every one of us to be a stronger force for good.
Thank you, Dr. West. My next question is for both Professor Stoughton and, is Stoughton correct? I'm sorry, is it Stoughton? Professor Stoughton and Chief Best. And so I don't know if you saw, but I saw this little clip today where the mayor of Compton, Asia Brown, was recently, I'm not sure if this was yesterday or the day before, but was pulled over in Compton, California, and was forced to get out of the car. They wanted to search the car for drugs or something. And then when she refused to comply and get out, and eventually they found out that she was the mayor, they still pulled out her husband and searched him, and then gave her a ticket and then didn't give her a ticket. Cause it was a pretty dramatic series of events. And you see her really passionately at the podium, sort of sharing her perspective of what had happened. And she went on to speak about how the police in Compton have terrorized the community, and has essentially said that it doesn't make sense to give them, was it $22 million more dollars? I'm not sure, Amjad, but it was something like, she named the money or the funds that were intended to be allocated to the police department, and obviously raised objection to that, and saying that we're not going to continue to give you these type of funds to terrorize our community. And here it is, the mayor having, you know, firsthand experience and recent in this climate with having been harassed. And so I guess my question is, what can really be done to impact policing and this culture that views African Americans, Black and brown people a certain way, and it doesn't matter what your degree of education or your place in life or what you have achieved, that you will time and time again continue to bump up against a certain type of resistance just to your presence. And yeah, so I just want to hear from you, Professor Stoughton, and as well as Chief Best, as to, you know, when you have a mayor of a city being pulled over, harassed, pulled out of a car being checked for drugs, you know, and X, Y, and Z, it gives so much credence to people who don't appear or look to be professional and have story after story of being terrorized. And Mayor Brown went as far as to say that, you know, Black people have degrees of PTSD that are immeasurable from just experiences with police. You know, I'm just quoting her. So can you speak to that to some degree?
Yeah, that's such a great question and such a powerful question. And I want to reiterate that some of that framing is exactly what Dr. Rose was talking about, right? I've come to the perspective that I don't think we have a race problem in policing. I think we have a race problem in society. And that race problem gets reflected and magnified because of the often adversarial context of police interactions. So I don't know that I see a way to change policing by itself without also dealing with some of the bigger problems in society. And let me give you a quick example, right? We could have the best trained, best run, best supervised police agency in the world. But when a white woman calls the police because a Black bird watcher has asked her to put a leash on her dog, the police are going to feel like they have to respond to that complaint, right? Or when someone calls the police about a Black graduate student who's sleeping in a dorm common room because they don't think that she belongs there. Or when the police are called because a gentleman from the United Arab Emirates is speaking Arabic on a phone in a hotel lobby, as happened a few years ago. That's a problem that we have to struggle with and overcome in society generally. There are also changes that I think we need to confront and address within policing, and particularly to the culture of policing. If you look at particularly marginalized neighborhoods, there is a complaint of heavily aggressive over-policing, the harassment that you mentioned, and a complaint at the same time of under-policing, that the police are not responding to what the community members are expressing as the problems that they would like the police to address. I think a lot of that has to do with the culture of policing as it's developed, acknowledging first that there are 18,000 police agencies in the country. So to say that there is a culture of policing is a little bit simplistic, but I'm going to engage with that simplicity for the sake of the conversation. Policing has either always been, in some contexts, or has certainly become more adversarial and confrontational. When you view yourself as the thin blue line against the forces of evil and anarchy, then you're looking for opponents. And we haven't done a very good job of teaching our officers that they are not soldiers on the front line, safeguarding the sanctity of good civilization against the forces of evil. They are instead, or at least the role that they should be playing, if any, is that of community guardians who are protecting all community members from unnecessary indignity and harm. It starts with respecting the sanctity of human life, but it also requires respecting human dignity. If you are treating someone, approaching someone as a possible suspect, or you are approaching someone as a community member, your two approaches, those two interactions are going to look very different in a number of what can be very small ways. If I can add one more thing, it's that we have delegated to the police, we as a society have delegated the police a whole range of issues that the police cannot adequately address. And it's because police arises out of this model of social control. But the police can't deal with homelessness or poverty or substance abuse or anger management or school discipline. Yet those are very routinely the aspects of public safety and public health infrastructure that we have defunded over the years or never adequately funded and just left it up to the police. Well, we don't need to fund the mental health services because we can just pick up a phone and call an officer to deal with that problem. When you take that approach and then compound it with what is now hundreds of years of either intentional or, let's be gracious and call it unintentional, racist policies in housing and education and, financial policies, then we're really setting the stage for problematic encounters with police. So the short answer, the short summary of my very long-winded answer is I think we need to change aspects of society to effectively change police. And also separately, we need to change and shift both the culture of police and also the tasks that we in society call upon police officers to fulfill.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. And just dovetailing off of that, how do we, what are some of the basic things that we can do to address the issues that also impact policing? So how do you address the woman who calls the guy, who calls the police? Because the guy is like, you need to put your dog on a leash, and she's literally on camera talking about, I'm gonna call the police and tell them that a black man is attempting to assault me. Like, how do we address these larger cultural things that are not separated out from law enforcement? Let's go back for a second, Chief Beston. I was just speaking about the culture of policing and speaking about Asia Brown, the mayor from Compton, and how she was recently pulled over and harassed by law enforcement. And she's on this podium speaking. I encourage everyone to watch it at some point. And she's absolutely livid. And here it is in this climate, seeing someone in a position of power in a Black city, and she speaks to law enforcement not living in that city and being sort of ushered in and basically terrorizing the community, and how much money that they spend to support and pay for policing, of course, people who are essentially terrorizing them. So I wanted you to speak to, this is not a lay person, you know, who's got some sort of shady record on the news speaking about their issues with police. This is the mayor of Compton, like, pulled over, pulled out of the car, husband searched, telling her that they want to search a car for drugs or something like that. How, when you have example after example, two things, I think, when you have examples like that, when you hear conversations around defunding the police.
Yeah.
And I've never been a big fan of how it's articulated, because it immediately always sounded like abolishment to me, right? Like, where you don't have police, and I don't think anybody wants that, like where you don't have law enforcement. But when you think about the lack of resources for Black and brown communities, or communities that are that are rich with people of color. And so often the systems that are supposed to be in place to help you towards a life of upward mobility don't exist. And you have these communities that are policed in ways that are heightened compared to non-Black and brown communities. And so you constantly have this people existing and living in this intersection between life and lack of opportunities, the perception of criminality, and law enforcement and that power in there. Like, how do you address these things around the culture of policing, where when it's problematic and when it's abused, it rears its head over and over again, and it is caused real trauma in people's lives. We get so caught up on, God bless that brother, George Floyd, the Breonna Taylors of the world. You can go on and on, Oscar Grant, go on forever. God bless them all. But what about the scores of people who have lived and who were not killed, but are still living with those offenses and those experiences and those things that has shaped and impacted their perception of law enforcement and what that relationship means to them and their community. So like what can be done to not just be putting a Band-Aid on this issue? And so I would love for you to speak to that, but then I would also love for you to speak to your unique conflict, because we spoke a little bit about some of your efforts in diversifying the police force and what that all means. So could you take it from there, essentially?
Yeah, I'd love to, Mr. Ali. I just, one, appreciate being here and the just empowering and wonderful words from the previous speakers. I have to start out by saying, as Dr. Stoughton, I think if I'm saying his name correctly, stated, I absolutely believe that we have a problem with, a race problem in society. And so it should be no surprise that we have a race problem in all of our systems, whether it's healthcare or education or, yes, criminal justice. I acknowledge, and we have to acknowledge, that when people of color, and specifically Black people, but whether they be Black or Asian or Latino or LGBTQ, or as Dr. West said, if they're just people who have been economically oppressed, that the police force was often used to maintain the status quo. And because of that, there is a natural, in some cases, fear, or in some cases, anger toward the police profession, or the police service, if you will. And so I think we can acknowledge that, but as you said, how are we going to find ways to move forward and ahead and bridge that racial gap that we have? It was alluded to earlier, the fact that, one, police are called to do so many things that really other systems should be taking care of. It's like the police are taking care of mental health. We, just in Seattle alone, 17,000 calls for crisis calls, people who are bona fide in crisis and a crisis state and need mental health care. Thousands of calls regarding people who are homeless on the streets, engaging in, sometimes, theft or robbery. But when you get there and you peel back the layers, it's like, okay, you call me because this person is stealing, but they're stealing sandwiches from your store, and they're standing there with nothing but a blanket and no shoes. So is the problem here this person is a criminal that's stealing, or is the problem here that we have an economic or mental health issue that we're dealing with? I mean, I think that police end up taking on a lot of those things that are the failures of other systems, in part when we're doing our regular work. And, they recruit from the human race and from the society that we live in. And we have a lot of racial issues in this country, and we have a lot of racial issues in a lot of professions. I can tell you one day, this is a quick story. I was clerk at my precinct and somebody called in. They didn't know. I picked up the phone, I answered, East Precinct, blah, blah, blah. And they said, hey, they wanted to complain about their neighbors' kids kept coming into their yard. You know, they kept throwing balls and hitting their cars and doing all this stuff. So I said, okay, well, I'm getting the information from him, you know, from the person. And I said, okay, and how old are the kids? I figured maybe it's teenagers and their little neighborhood dispute. We can come talk to them, whatever. And he goes, well, they're 3 and they're 4. He goes, and they're Black, just like that.
Mhm.
I just hung up the phone. I was like, you don't have a problem here. You do have a problem, but it's not a police problem. You know what I mean? So it's funny when you say these things, just, you know, I wear a uniform and I wore it, you know, for today as well. But, it, you know, I always tell people, I came out of the womb a Black woman.
Yes.
I'm going to be police chief for this moment in time.
Yes.
But I'm always going to be a Black woman. So
Yes.
it's some of the same PTSD, if you will, that people are mentioning that other people have. I have it too. I see every week, you know, another African-American man, unarmed, you know, who dies at the hands of sometimes police and sometimes their neighbors, you know, but certainly of injustice. And I feel the same trauma everyone else feels. And so I think that the way that we're going to have to go about it is, you know, honestly, you know, this whole defund the police, and it depends on what it means. I really think that it shouldn't just be like defunding, like just, you know, firing people and laying them off. But I do think that we need to sort of re-envision, you know, how we're going to do public safety and how we're going to keep people feeling safe and bring that humanity back to everything. I mean, I think that is the crux of all of it. You know, there is a grave indifference to human life. I don't care if you're a police officer or not. To be able to hold your knee on somebody's neck while they're crying out for help and asking for their mama for almost 10 minutes. There's something deeper going on there than just what the uniform brings. I mean, the uniform gave you maybe the authority to do it, but there's a far underlying deeper issue there that we have to look at. So I really think that part of that means that we might need to, as the title of this segment is, reform, and reform in a way that brings in community-led, you know, conversations, that pays attention to the stress and the post-traumatic stress that people experience every time they see someone unarmed die very quickly at the hands of police or others, and try to move us forward, deconstructing and reforming. But what I don't like, here's where the rub is for me, because I'm not opposed to changing things. I'd like to see a plan to do it. Like any empirical study shows, here's my control group, and here's the experimental group. And here's what we're gonna do to make things better. So that we know if you wanna send a social worker out instead of sending a police officer, that might be the right answer, but let's make sure that social worker has the training. The system is in place for them to respond at 2 a.m. when the person is, you know, in the middle of the street, naked, screaming, that we have the appropriate level of people to answer those calls, and that, you know, we make sure that they themselves aren't bringing their own racial biases and implicit bias to the work that they're doing. I mean, it's most obvious in policing because we're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But I can assure you, your teachers, your bus drivers, your social workers, your professors, and others also have histories of race and racism in their own institutions. So I think we need to be digging deep to have those real conversations like we're having today about how we move the needle. And it can't just be, in my view, just lopping people off, but actually looking at theory, you know, in some cases untested theory, but applying it in a way that we can actually research it and develop it and see if it works.
Yes. Thank you.
Mahershala, I just wanted to interject. I want to keep this conversation going, but the audience, I would like to let them know that, you know, in a few minutes, we're going to turn to questions. We have a number of questions in the Q&A. We'll turn those to the panelists, and we can also take some questions on the audio. So if you want to raise your hand and We can take a few questions towards the back end. We want to make this interactive. We have a few more minutes. You were asking a question, Mahershala, of Dr. Rose and Dr. West. I want to let you, finish that and get that in.
Excuse me, I was asking a question of Dr. Actually, I was gonna move towards these ideas of policing that Dr. Rose, Professor Stoughton feel like will actually work. Like, what are the models, dovetailing off of Chief Best's comments? Like, what are versions or pitchable models for a culture that we could kind of all get behind and sort of envision as serving us better.
Right. I just want to, I'm just so happy to be in this conversation. I feel like we've gotten much further than many of these get to. So I just want to thank you, Mahershala, for bringing this and putting this together. But I just want to focus on a couple of things that might feel a little bit in contradiction to what we've been saying, but I think maybe if we figure it out together, we'll see where the overlaps are. That is, the fact that while we don't want to fire and reduce the livelihoods of new diverse police forces that you've handpicked, right, Chief, to try to make things better. On the other hand, police forces have been dramatically expanded over the last 30 to 40 years, not only in personnel, but in budgets. So it's not just a matter of coming up with alternative solutions, but that we have to reduce the role of the police, which will mean we're going to reduce the number of police and we're going to have to reduce the budgets of police. You can't simply say that we need more social workers, as we all agree, right, to cover a lot of the kinds of work that police have been left to do, and then just keep this huge police force with nothing to do but find, to get into bad trouble, to quote the opposite of John Lewis. So we have to recognize that they've been expanded dramatically and that there have been incentives, right? There have been literal incentives, municipal fees and fines, balancing municipal budgets on the backs of poor people who the police can extract resources from by fining them, and then when those fines don't get paid, eventually they turn into criminal fines, and then eventually they get fed into the system, and that debt and the fees associated with it become part of the economic engine. So, we have to be honest about all of that too. In part of the solution, the police we may need, I think, has to be deeper than reform. I think abolishment is too far, and I think defunding is too abstract at this point. But I think we have to reallocate resources for municipal support for our citizens that involves moving money back into education, back into medical support, back into mental health resources, back into public housing. With all of those resources have been reallocated into extra funding for the police. That's really what's happened. If you look at the data, so that has to ultimately happen. And frankly, police unions have to be pressured into recognizing that they can't function, the way they're functioning, right? Where there's very little rules for accountability, accountability, and what you'd call sort of community surveillance and participation in the process. So those are some other factors that have to happen. And then finally, I'd say, really importantly, there's no way that we can continue to allow people to police communities and not live in them, or live in similar adjacent communities. It only reinforces the very problems that we do see everywhere. I'm not suggesting the police are alone. On our podcast that I have with Cornel West, where we co-host, we talked about this defunding of the police. And, a lot of it has to do with recognizing that the police have been authorized through segregation, through distancing, through class hierarchy, through all these other economic factors to use the forces of the state to, really violate people in fundamental ways. And so for them to have no community accountability, they don't have to know the people, they don't have any relationship to them, that has to stop significantly. But I think the main thing when we're talking about change is to not be afraid of really asking ourselves, okay, we know we have a wide range of social problems. We know we have some real criminals that need some correction, right? I think that's obvious. I tell my abolitionist friends, well, I'm not interested in trying to be neighbors with a serial killer. I'm trying to keep just a little distance, just a little bit, but at the same time, there's so much that can be responded to differently. And as the chief says, we need to be not only training people for that, but we need to commit to it. We need to say, hey, what do we want our kids to receive when they're in trouble? How do we want them to be cared for, right? And so when we really answer that honestly, then we get at what Dr. West was talking about around whose innocence we believe and whose innocence has been rendered invisible and rendered impossible. And so Black innocence is almost an oxymoron to people. And so when you really have that kind of a conversation, now you'll be saying, okay, here are the kind of people who might need jail, who might need surveillance, who might need, correctional facilities. And then the vast majority of people are going to need any number of other things. And I think we have to be able to confront that. That will mean some kind of defunding, right? Because of the expansion that's already taken place. And so I think it's a mindset that has to be shifted there as much as it is about the content, right? It's about opening it up and saying, okay, what do we need? What do we need? We don't need police per se to do everything, but what do we need? And what does that cost?
Well,
may I? Oh,
please.
Dr. Rose, I love what you're saying. And I would say I agree with that. And what I guess my question was, as we ask that question, we know we're going to have to reduce resources or even the number of officers maybe doing some of the work that they're doing. And what I would like to hear is like, what fills in the gap? And community needs to lead that discussion about, what it is we want to see. And and what's the plan there? So as you said, when we go to a call and there is somebody with a domestic violence or a child that needs help or whatever it may be, and maybe there's a resource that's better, what is that resource and how do we, move things from one area to another for public health, public safety?
Right. Well, we built it. We're going to have to figure out how to dismantle some of it. It's not going to be overnight. I mean, you're right. It's a long distance project. But I guess what I worry about, Chief, is that people are so afraid, right? Because again, this is all based on, the kind of, brutality and violence that Dr. West was talking about. So people are afraid that the hordes of non-white people are going to just come over the wall and take over the world. I mean, it's like people are terrified. Every presidential campaign in my lifetime as a person, you say more than 10 years old, I can remember the kind of racial terrorism that was built into why people should vote for a law and order campaign, right? Based candidate, right? This is the core of what we're talking about. So I want to encourage people to not be so afraid and to use their imagination and to think from the vantage point of how do they want people to respond to their own children, to their own relatives, to their own parents, to their elderly uncle who might have mental illness struggles or who might be an alcoholic. How do they want people and police and society, not police, but society to respond? And so that's what I'm hoping. It's not that we agree. You're right. It's going to take some work, but I don't want there to be so much fear to drive that sense of we just got to keep growing this. We need, as the statistics that were shown much earlier, we need to give the police more money. What's more money? 77%. So, yeah, I mean, that's
same or more. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. I want us to reduce that fear, to start thinking imaginatively about how to care for each other. Again, back to what Dr. West was saying about that kind of human, empathy and care, because once that's in place, all of this makes no sense. It just doesn't make any sense.
I'm going to have a question from the audience here to Dr. Cornel West, but before I do, I want to give Professor Stoughton a chance to chime in on this discussion around this question now.
Yeah, it's such a good question and it's such a pertinent one, right? Okay, so what do we do, right? And I think there are some very discrete things that we can start looking at, right? One, the issue that Dr. Rose brought up about fear is incredibly important. We have fundamentally conflated policing and public safety. And policing is a part of public safety, but we have exaggerated the role of policing within public safety discussions. And that has often fallen along power lines, along race, class, and gender lines, right? If you look at, for example, the history of drug prohibitions, one of the earliest drug prohibitions was the San Francisco Ordinance in the late 1800s that banned, if you will excuse the phrase, Chinamen, which is the phrase that was used in the ordinance, from smoking opium, because the fear was that it would make Chinese men go crazy and rape white women. And in the 1930s, we saw exactly the same thing with marijuana. Marijuana was very explicitly prohibited, first at the local and state level and ultimately federal, because the fear was it was going to make Mexican and Black men go crazy and rape white women. The response to that was a police response, was to criminalize that, right? To treat that as a criminal justice issue. And we see that in a number of areas. So we need to decouple policing and public safety, or at least we need to recognize that the Venn diagram of policing and public safety, policing actually plays a much smaller role than we have set it up to. And part of that is a very discrete step that we could take. We can stop evaluating police agencies by relying on metrics that either don't matter or that create perverse incentives. One of the primary ways that societies, city hall, or county commissions evaluate police agencies is by looking at crime rates. And while we know that policing does have a relationship with crime, we also know that it is an attenuated and complicated relationship. An agency can be doing everything right and crime can go up. An agency can be doing everything wrong and crime can still go down. So when we fire a police chief because crime rates start going up, for example, which happens all the time, the average large city police chief has a tenure of 3 to 5 years. What happens is the police chief starts focusing on short-term efforts to reduce crime. And that's where you get tactics like broken windows or aggressive focus on quality of life issues that can drive down particularly low-level crime in the short term, but can also become criminogenic. They can cause more crime in the midterm or long term, because now you have a whole lot more people who have a criminal history, who are less employable in legal markets, for example. We evaluate police agencies by looking at rapid response rates. What's the agency's response time? Well, we have a number of studies that tell us that response time, except in very rare circumstances like burglaries in progress, response time doesn't actually improve the delivery of police services, and it doesn't really improve the public perception of the delivery of police services. So how do we improve response time? We put more officers on the streets, right? We create that perverse incentive. We can get rid of what's been called cash register justice or policing for profit. Things like civil asset forfeiture, for example, but not just civil asset forfeiture. Also, as Dr. Rose mentioned, the use of criminalization of unpaid fines and fees, particularly for missing court dates. When we know also from research that if we had even a automated text-based reminder that is as effective, if not more effective, at getting people to go to their court dates than locking them up if they don't. These are sort of part of a much broader conversation, but there are a number of very specific, very discrete things that we could do tomorrow. In addition to what I absolutely agree is a much longer term effort, a 5-year, a 10-year, a 20-year effort to create a mental health infrastructure with social workers or mental health professionals who can respond 24 hours a day, right? We don't have that right now outside of Eugene, Oregon and the Cahoots program. We don't really have that. So we can't just take police out of that picture immediately until someone can pick that up. But there are things that we can be doing tomorrow that will contribute to those longer term efforts.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stoughton. I think there's a number of hands up and a number of questions. So let's take a few. This one to Dr. West. Dominic Bell asks, how do we address corporate, governmental, and institutional pandering to racial justice narratives in this moment? which pay lip service to equality narratives without engaging in any meaningful action? Do you fear that corporate America is mining racial injustice along two axes, racial economic violence and falsified virtuous narratives of progress as a response? And is there any danger of Black careerism in this moment? And how do we confront it? So a number of questions. Dr. West?
Yeah, well, we've got a high quality panel and a high quality audience here because this dialogue has been so rich, and the query is such a powerful one. It's impossible to do justice to the query. But just very briefly, certainly, we've got to come to terms with the intimate connection between police power, Wall Street power, and Pentagon power. And police brutality, police crimes, when committed. And when committed, fair trial, go to jail, just like everybody else. Corporate power, corporate crimes. When they commit the crimes, go to jail. How many Wall Street executives went to jail in 2008? Insider trading, market manipulation, fraudulent activity, predatory lending, not one. So it's clear that our rule of law tends to be very, very vigilant when it comes to poor and working people, especially people of color, but poor people across the board, working people across the board. When it comes to white collar and high places, oh, that kind of wickedness, we turn our faces because often they are the politicians who are tied to those Wall Street entities. You know, it could be Eric Holder, Obama, and the others bringing in all of these corporate elite, Tim Geithner, Larry Summers, and others to turn their faces away from the Wall Street crimes so that not one would go to jail. Well, see, poor and working people are not stupid. They can see the hypocrisy even when they celebrate the symbol. And Pentagon, we hardly even get a chance to talk about. But if you got 800 military units around the world, you're dropping 25,000 bombs annually, and you're killing people, and all you have to do is ask our precious Muslim brothers and sisters in the last 20 years, how many innocent Muslims have died as a result of U.S. bombs? Almost 500,000 Iraqis. We don't say a mumbling word. Well, I'm a Christian. Every Muslim life has exactly the same value as a Christian life, as a Jewish life, as a Buddhist life, as a Hindu life, across the board, regardless of color, gender, sexual orientation, or religion. So that the militarism abroad, as Martin King used to say, you drop those bombs abroad, they also fall in ghettos, in reservations, and working class communities. And so the connections between the ways in which our structures of domination are function, the predatory capitalism, if it continues to generate high levels of poverty, cannot produce schools of quality, cannot produce jobs with a living wage, cannot produce access to health care, then all the police and prisons in the world can't deal with the paranoia that flows from poverty and the despair that flows from the distrust that the deep wealth inequality generates. And at that point, it's not just the police. I mean, Black people, we have had to deal with vigilante activities among fellow citizens, with lynching. Right? It wasn't just the police killing Black people. And in the last 50 years, more and more, we got Black people killing each other because of despair. We got to move to Dostoevsky. You got to move to Richard Wright. You got to move to Toni Morrison. The artists tell us that the nihilism, the hopelessness, the helplessness, the meaninglessness flowing from shattered families and shattered communities where people feel as if the only thing they can depend upon is, in fact, self-medication and self-defense with a gun. The violence that cuts so deep that the great Jim Lawson spoke about with such power at Brother John Lewis's funeral the other night. All these are different levels of it that have to be teased out in such a way that we're really true to the evil, because that's what we're dealing with: evil, unjustified suffering, unmerited hurt, unwarranted pain that is structural and institutional, but it's also interpersonal too. But that's the beginning of an answer to that very powerful query.
Mm-hmm. What an answer it was. Thank you, Dr. West. I'm going to actually take a couple of questions now. Fritz Esker, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please.
Yeah, what Dr. West just said about the role of artists made me want to ask Mr. Ali a question in, talking about cultural and social change and awareness. you've been in films like Green Book and Moonlight that have highlighted marginalized groups. How do you feel Hollywood as a whole is living up to the challenge of educating the public about these issues right now?
Wow. I feel I've been talking about race for 20 years in Hollywood from the moment I started acting. And when I came into the business, the NAACP was successful in getting and working with the networks. They had been successful in putting pressure on the networks to make a commitment to diversifying their shows. So this was 20 years ago when at some point a show just kind of had to have a Black person on it. Didn't mean that you got to do anything on it, but you kind of just had to have one on there somewhere. And so that at one point felt like an achievement for the industry in some way, you know, to be making an effort. And that obviously has fallen well short of what we needed, but there was like a crack in the door. And I think over the course of after 2000, 2001-ish or so, around the time of Moonlight, I feel like things cracked open quite a bit. And in part because of the success of that film, there are literally no white people in that movie anywhere. That film was the first film with that small of a budget to win the Academy Award for Best Film. And that film, I think, prompted a lot of conversations. And I think it kind of sort of proved to be a marker for where there was an awareness, a conversation that had opened up around representation and diversity, unique experiences, unique voices. And that ended up, I think, propelling the industry into a very clear effort towards expanding the presence of Black people, Black and brown people, and making sure Black, brown, LGBTQ have a real place in this industry. And so by no means has it been corrected, but I would be, it wouldn't be truthful if I said that things haven't changed and aren't in the process of improving in a way that I think is probably heightened compared to most other industries. And I think that's because there's so many people of color that have platforms that can speak to what is going on in our industry that almost kind of serve to police it. So I think that Hollywood has an advantage compared to a lot of other systems towards improving, even though it was also so behind in certain ways.
Thank you, Mahershala, for that answer. Amatul Mueed Anderson, your hand is up. Can you hear us okay? You can ask your question.
Yeah, yes, assalamu alaikum. Yeah, this question is for Mr. Stoughton. I want to know why it seems that you were saying that the police should be excused from their position of violence, brutality, and killing, and not being held accountable because the society has problems. We're dealing with systemic racism, not just police brutality. And that is true. You're absolutely right about that. But I want to know, how is it that as an organization and as a force that arrives at situations of conflict and unrest with weapons that can kill, that can maim, how could they be excused and not take responsibility for being part of that evolution? Because I feel that we're in an evolutionary process right now. We bank internationally, people travel internationally. We've got transportation going left and right. So to me, we're turning into a a community, a worldwide community, so that we're not so caught on I, me, my. So as we grow up, we mature and we can appreciate what has been created for us, all around us, including others. So how is it that this organization should be excused from part of that evolutionary process? And the other thing I want to say is money talks. We all know that. And the way that our government has set up the system is so that people who look like the lawmakers and the landowners are able to use that money to speak for them. People who do not look like the overarching power figures do not have that money to speak for them. So we know money talks. So I'm also speaking about defunding the police and the responsibility of all of us to act in accordance with justice. And particularly when you show up and you're paid by the community to serve and to protect, you show up with weapons that will kill and maim, but yet you're not to be held accountable for your actions. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for that question. There are a couple of questions in there that I want to separate out a little bit, right? So one, I think it's very important that we understand root and systemic causes of why we have the situation that we have. That doesn't mean that we excuse misconduct or violence, particularly when it's unwarranted, or that we overlook it when it's questionable. So when you say how is that police agencies, that police officers haven't been held accountable, I'm gonna turn that into two different questions, right? One is, to use the fancy academic term, the normative question: should they be held accountable? And the other is the descriptive question: if they should be held accountable and we think that there's a gap, that they haven't been held accountable, why does that gap exist? The first question is the easier one to deal with. Should policing as an institution, or should police agencies, or should individual police officers be held accountable? Yes, absolutely. I might understand why one of my children misbehaves, but I'm still going to correct them for that misbehavior, even if I understand the underlying reasons for it. The underlying reasons might affect how I correct them, but it doesn't mean that they get a pat on the head and like, okay, well, now I understand why you did this thing you weren't supposed to do. I don't see any difference with policing. If we want to see short-term, midterm, or long-term change, we do have to understand the reasons, because the reasons are, the systems are what we need to shift, not the individual bad actors or the individual bad agencies, if you will. So why haven't they been, right? This is a whole set of complicated reasons. We can get into police unions, which I know a couple of folks have mentioned in the chat or in the Q&A. Police unions wield a tremendous amount of political power. They are visible at the federal level, but most of their power is actually wielded at the state and local level. So they can have a tremendous impact. The collective bargaining agreements that police unions enter into do, all other things being equal, do result in officers being higher paid, and thus you would expect to attract a better class, for whatever that means, of officers. But it also, at least according to a fascinating study out of Florida, police unionization also increases officer misconduct. And part of the way that it does that is it creates both substantive and procedural barriers to officers being investigated and disciplined the way that they would be were it not for those collective bargaining agreements. Not just a collective bargaining agreement is the agreement between the union and its members and the city or the county, whoever they work for. Sometimes police unions have successfully lobbied for state laws that protect police officers, or less often police agencies, but have protected police officers. For example, more than a dozen states have what are called law enforcement officer Bill of Rights, which limit how officers can be investigated, who can investigate them, when they can be investigated, and for what, for example. And there are some benefits to police agencies, right? Until very recently, California, for example, had a very restrictive law that did not allow police agencies to share officers' personnel files, which they read to include disciplinary files, disciplinary history. So there was no public record or publicly available information about officers and what they had been disciplined for. That both protects individual officers. It also protects agencies who empower officers to engage in inappropriate actions and misconduct. So when I make my comments, I hope that I'm not coming across as saying, and therefore everything in policing is okay. I want to try and correct what I think are very deep and very deep-rooted and long-running issues in policing. If we don't understand why we have those issues, both historically and today, then we're going to be at a significant disadvantage in correcting them. And my worry is we will build an alternate system that looks a lot like the current system, right? And Dr. West was absolutely right when he pointed out that just it's not just police violence that's problematic, right? Trayvon Martin was not killed by a police officer. Ahmaud Arbery was not killed by a police officer acting on duty. So we need to address the bigger systems. That doesn't mean that we excuse either individual officers, police agencies, or policing as an institution for its missteps and the way that it and they and I have contributed to some of these deeper issues. I hope that's at least a partial answer.
Yeah, a lot of questions coming in, terrific questions. Obviously, getting close to the top of the hour, so we'll get through a few of them. There's a question here, I think for Chief Best. You can opine on this. This is Brandon Taylor. Certain crimes come from desperation and human needs not being met. Could some of the funding usually given to police instead be allocated to crime-stricken communities in the form of bills being paid, food being put on the table, healthcare being made available?
Yeah, Brandon, thank you for that. I think that there are a lot of ways that could happen. In some cases, for example, like if we're responding to a domestic violence situation, typically, not always, when the victim is a woman, we will often have resources available through victim advocates or others, not police officers, who will move them to shelters or alternative housing, or find a place for them to be with their children, give them vouchers for food, vouchers for clothing, and that kind of a thing. And this is another example of a situation where the police are called to something while the domestic violence itself, in and of itself, may be a crime situation. A lot of the outcomes and a lot of the other issues surrounding it much better handled by some other type of human services. And I gave the example earlier, for example, when we were getting multiple calls of theft from, different grocery stores or chains, and we get there and it's a person who, yes, took an item of food or some items of food, and the officer is very conflicted because the person has so many other issues besides the $10 sandwich that they took, that the response isn't a criminal justice response, and it shouldn't be. There are other services and needs that should be there, and I don't think anybody on a human level would argue with, as Dr. Rose has said, if we remove some of the funding for budgets, and that money was placed in another area to do just that type of response and reallocation. Again, it just needs to be thought out about what that looks like. But that's a very good question and very feasible.
And Chief Best, just a quick follow-up here. Another question from Nusrat Bashir: can a psychological test or psychological testing, or can that identify people with racism, that type of test be given to candidates for the police force? Perhaps this could prevent racist candidates from being hired. she asks.
Yeah, people ask that all of the time. That is not an unusual question. And so I think that police agencies, I could certainly speak for my own, but I think even across the board, do a lot of background and a lot of work on trying to make sure that they weed out people who have a propensity for or have shown an issue with race, race-based issues, and that kind of a thing. Even with that screening and that deep backgrounding, we often get people, sometimes not often, but we do get people who really do act on some of their implicit biases. One of the things that we've done, now this is post hiring, is we have implicit bias training to make sure that people recognize that while everybody has their biases, you need to recognize what they are, be alerted to them, and then your behavior needs to be equal no matter what. So we will gauge if you made 400 traffic stops, and if you have an issue that of those stops, only the people of color or only the women or only the wealthy or whatever it is seem to get tickets, then there's a bias there, whether implicit or explicit. It comes out explicitly that we need to address. So I think that the idea of testing for race is not a foreign idea. Racism, that is not a foreign idea. But even the backgrounding, sometimes things like that, or if you have a person who's a psychopath or sociopath, let's just say, it gets through. So we really have to look at the behaviors that are exhibited once they're employed. But we definitely try to screen out for those types of issues, much more so than I would say anyone else. The clergy doesn't have it, professors don't have it, teachers don't have it, but in our profession, where you're carrying around deadly force that was mentioned beforehand, we really try to make sure we're screening out for those issues.
Can I add very
Yes,
briefly to
please,
that?
Seth. Yeah, go ahead.
So the implicit bias thing is difficult, and I don't want to get into that. But just to address the question of, is there a test we can do? The short answer is no, not really. We just don't have the science to suggest that there is a test that can do more than capture an in-the-moment snapshot, and that's not a particularly reliable way of identifying someone's views. I wish it was the case. Unfortunately, a lot of our hiring practices at many agencies, although not all, are roughly the same that they have been over the last 40 years, right? We do need a lot more research into not just how to weed out the worst candidates, which is what the current psychological tests, usually the MMPI and the CPI-2 are aimed at. They're aimed at weeding out the worst candidates, but we have not done a very good job of developing evidence-based ways to identify the best candidates. That's something I'm sure the chief and every police leader would like to see happen, but we just don't have that right now.
Yeah, thank you for that, Professor Stoughton. This question is for Dr. Rose, Dr. West. Can either of you, both of you here in this instance, address the role that love of our fellow human beings for each other must play in accomplishing changes that we're talking about that need to take place?
Ooh, Sister Tricia, your whole
no, Cornel, you should
about that.
No, please.
You go right ahead.
No. I think we have swing for the fences, my dear.
Yeah, I think that when we think of anti-idolatry, there is no God but Allah. That means that all other gods must be rendered secondary, tertiary, so that material success, so that financial prosperity, so that celebrity status is not a sign of moral excellence and spiritual greatness. Now, I speak as a Christian, and I pull from my precious Jewish brothers and sisters that thou shalt have no other God before me. Anti-idolatrous. Anti-idolatry means we got to push back indifference. And the opposite of indifference is love. You got to push back callousness. The opposite of callousness is compassion. You got to push back being well adjusted to a status quo and well adapted to an indifference in the name of a compassion. And by love, all we mean is a steadfast commitment to the welfare of others that gets us outside of our egoism and narcissism and tribalism, and yes, even our forms of nationalism that lose sight of the precious humanity of people all around the world. So the love warriors like a Martin King or a Fannie Lou Hamer or John Coltrane or Jim Lawson or Diane Nash, all of these folk are telling to us, how do we fortify ourselves to muster the courage to think critically, the courage to compassionately act and sustain a hope, understanding hope as a verb as much as a virtue. And that project has always been over against every historical moment that we, human species, have been alive. It's always over again, from Socrates to Jesus to Muhammad to, you can go all the way up to whoever it is. I mean, people who are loving in terms of tied to truth and goodness and beauty, and for some religious like myself, the holy. And so it seems to me in that way, love is unavoidable, inescapable, but it's always appearing weak. It always appears feeble, but in the end, it is going to be the key that unlocks the door to ultimate reality in terms of what can save and rescue us from our disastrous behavior as a species, as human beings.
Dr. West, as you were answering that, another question has come up, and it dawned on me, and it's actually alluding to a couple of the statements that I got on the screen from His Holiness. He's talking about that in order for justice to prevail, we must ever be faithful to the truth and be willing to give evidence against ourselves and our loved ones. So a question comes, how can we work to reorient the current conversation about policing, which is characterized by deep division and tribal partisan loyalty, towards a culture of absolute truth, even if it means sacrificing one's own ego or interest? It related to your answer just now, so I thought I would ask that as well.
Well, one, there is no love without genuine humility. There is no love without genuine vulnerability. There is no love without genuine invincibility. And all three of those require self-scrutiny, self-examination. But we connect that kind of humility with a strong moral and spiritual tenacity. Reinhold Niebuhr used to say, any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. The only thing that sustains justice, what the Isley brothers call a caravan of love, or what the OJs call a love train. Love is much deeper than justice. It's tied to justice. Justice is what love looks like in public, but love is much deeper because love embraces mercy. Justice doesn't necessarily embrace mercy. Shakespeare taught us that in The Merchant of Venice, and Julius' great reflection on mercy. Love embraces sweetness, kindness, being gentle. That justice doesn't necessarily do that. Something deeper is at work that's undergirding our commitment to social justice, fairness, and so forth. And this is again why the primacy of the moral and the centrality of the spiritual must infuse our attempt to be freedom fighters and love warriors and to go down swinging, because we're going to be, in some sense, trashed, rebuked, if not assassinated, if not crucified, if not undercut, because the dominant ways of the world are domination and hatred and envy and resentment.
Dr. Rose, as Dr. West was giving that wonderful answer, I'm sure many on this call, a number of people up here are from the Muslim community, and Mahershala will appreciate this point as well, is there's every Friday, during the Friday sermon, the second sermon in Arabic on the holy day of Muslims, there is an Arabic phrase that said, Adl Ihsan Ita Zil Qurba, justice, kindness, and loving someone as if they're your own kin. These are the three stages of supreme justice, you can say, in Islam. And as he was talking, as Dr. West was talking, I was thinking about the minimum safeguard, right, in an Islamic governance system is justice. That's minimum. But kindness and loving someone as if they're your own relative, that's the peak, the height of supreme justice in the Quran, in Islam. I wanted you to talk a bit about kindness and love as a complement to justice as it relates to policing and everything we've been talking about.
Wow. That's very, very beautiful. Well, a while ago, I did some research on Lorraine Hansberry, and I wrote a piece that revolved around what I thought was the misunderstanding of the true politics of Raisin in the Sun. It's often treated as this story of integration and the success of a Black family moving to a white neighborhood, which is not at all what it's about. The climax of the play is when the grandmother of the multi-generational family, is telling the daughter, who's enraged about her brother's failures, who's lost a bunch of money and made some terrible decisions, and she wants to disown him. And the culminating moment of that play is when Mama says, there's, first of all, walk in his shoes, but most importantly, there's always something left to love, right? And that you don't throw people away, right? You don't imagine that that they're worthy of complete failure and marginalization and sort of exclusion, and that it wasn't a defense only of Walter, who's Benita's brother. It's also about a way of understanding who we are in relationship to each other, that no one should be fundamentally put out forever. And, honestly, I don't want, police who've done horrible things any more than anyone else who's done horrible things to be banished, to be shunned, to be harmed similarly. I don't think that's the answer. There has to be extraordinary accountability, and there has to be a transformation of the behavior and psyche of those people, just like everybody else. But you have to be able to say that everybody's worth that redemption in that process, because if they're not, it just devolves immediately into to a kind of violent tribalism that knows no end. Because what are the boundaries of inside and outside? Inside what? Is it a patriarchal problem? Is it a homophobic problem? Is it a racial problem? Is it a class problem? Is it a religious? Who's in and out? Next, there's not one in and one out. It's multiple ins and multiple outs. And eventually everybody's on the outside of somewhere. And so for me, that's really been a very important phrase for me, to figure out, even when you really don't want to deal with something, and you may not want to spend a lot of social time with everybody. I'm not saying you got to break bread every weekend with people who are hateful, but if you can remind yourself that everybody has something left to love in that fundamental sense, that I think it's a gateway to some form of recognition about our permanent relationality to one another.
Mahershala, we're hour 45, and I feel like we're just warming up. I have a number of questions coming in the chat. If it's okay with you, I'll take one from the audience right now, and we'll keep this going a little bit, but we'll try to wrap up soon because we're getting a little bit long. Is that okay, Mahershala?
I just saw Chief Bet. I have a hair more time, but it's
yeah, I got you. We'll wrap up. Let me take a question here. Khan, your hand is up.
Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace and blessings. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So I just wanted to share more than a question. I want to share my thoughts as we end our session today. The first that I wanted to share was, as we talk about social movements throughout history, we've seen women, especially Black women, who've been left out. So when we talk about supreme justice, I couldn't help but think about, after first session, what supreme justice is. And there's no justice when women are not served with justice. And we've seen this in the case throughout the movement of Black Lives Matter, where there was not a male after the death of, George Floyd, and we've seen many Black men who have died in the hands of, who have been murdered in the hands of police, but yet there was not an uproar after Breonna Taylor. There was not an uproar after many Black women who were murdered. And I think I just want to really point out the inequality when it comes to gender and within social movements. And the second thing I would like to just sort of share my thoughts on is defunding the police. I know Dr. Rose sort of mentioned that, and she said it's an abstract way of, talking about it. And I think it's just so important to understand people have the wrong conception of what defunding the police means. And I think it's so important to realize that it means to invest in those communities that were left behind, to especially invest in Black communities, communities of color, have those mental resources for those, for, decrease recidivism rates, for those who are left when they come out of incarceration, they're basically left as a slave status. They can't vote, they can't do anything. It's to provide those resources. I think it's so important for us, our generation, our people in the cities we are living, to really understand, be involved, know the mayor's budget, know what budget's being allocated where, to stand up, to really understand what's going on, to vote for the right candidate. It's so important for us to be involved in these ways and be aware, because I'm sure, I am from Buffalo, New York, and it's one of the highest segregated cities out there. And it's just so important to know your city and know what's going on and how you can help by raising a voice. So I thank you. I just wanted to share my thoughts on that.
The one thing I would say that I would disagree about the Breonna Taylor a bit, from the standpoint of, I think that there has been an uprising associated with Breonna Taylor. I feel like it's been clear that starting in Kentucky, that people have been very present and in the streets, but Breonna Taylor's murder happened in the context of a George Floyd video that we could clearly had the video to couple with his death. And I think considering that there hasn't been I think that if there was videotape or body cam footage of Breonna Taylor's death, I think that it would be akin to the response to George Floyd. But I think with George Floyd, encapsulated in that response was the idea that this is the straw that has broken the camel's back. And that just came off with the brother getting killed with the shotgun as well. And all these, several incidences. So, but in general, that is a truth that black women and Black women specifically haven't traditionally received the attention, the support hasn't come to their families in the same ways that in part it is come for Black men. But I just wanted to just kind of share that I somewhat disagree about the Breonna Taylor of it all, because I see posts to this day about apologizing to the family because justice has not happened yet for Breonna Taylor, So I think that her name and what is pending around that entire situation is very much part of this larger conversation. I think personally, I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between, you never want to render invisible the voices that have been raised, so that there have been voices raised for our dear sister Breonna. We're having a concert for her just at the end of this month at St. Stephen's Baptist Church under Reverend Kevin Cosby, and there's going to be thousands and thousands of people on that Zoom. There were people who had her names all around the country. So that in that sense, you never want to downplay the visible voices, but it's also true that we got to fight against this vicious patriarchy. We got to fight against this ugly sexism, and therefore we have to recognize that a Black woman's life is as precious and priceless as a Black man's life, and we haven't raised enough voices around Black women's voices. But my dear sister from Buffalo says that there hasn't been any. You see, we got to watch that kind of language, because you never want to disempower the people who have been raising their voices for Black women for a long time, including the Black women themselves for a long time. Those voices matter. They just have not been taken as seriously as they ought, but they do matter. People's voices have been raised.
Well, yes, that is very true. And this idea of democratic movement and change at the ballot box, which is so essential and connected to everything that we've been talking about coming up in these final months is so key. This creating this movement, this alliance for absolute justice through democratic movement is so essential and pivotal to some of the reforms that have been talked about. I think we'll end right in 10 minutes here. So in these final 10 minutes, there's a number of questions. What I'll do is this, the questions that are on the Q&A that have come in, there are, let's see, roughly 20 or so that have been unanswered. We'll make sure that those get answered by a panelist. We'll share those offline to the panelists to the extent if they're so gracious to answer some of them. We'll really appreciate that so that you get answers for those questions. I see a few hands raised up here as well, and we can take a few of those now. And I would say that to the people that were taking the questions, if you can keep your question short and direct it to a panelist, that would be helpful. So Linta Rashid, your hand is up. If you can ask your question.
Okay. Hey, so my question is for Rose, Stoughton, and West. Would you say that the root cause of these racist structures, or rather the racist structures themselves, are just mechanisms of settler colonialism?
Heavy question, but anyone can take that. Go ahead.
I'm going to speak just a little bit out of school on this one because I am, this is not my area. I don't know if I would agree quite that it was colonialism, but I think it probably comes from the same belief structures that promoted violent colonialism, if that makes sense, right? Not colonialism in the sense that a great deal of our racial structures in the United States were built not just on violent colonialism and displacing and exterminating a native population, but also, of course, importing whole countries worth of slaves from Africa and the Caribbean. So I'm not sure I get the colonial connection, but I do think that the idea, this sort of channeled through manifest destiny or white superiority, which I'm using in the historical context to separate it from contemporary white supremacy, although I think there's an obvious connection between the impetus, the belief system there and the contemporary white supremacy. I think they share a root, but I think they may be slightly different. I'm delighted to be corrected on that, though.
Okay.
Did you want to say a word, Sister Tricia, on that?
No, please, you go ahead.
What is that one? You should. I know it's getting late, but yeah, that's a tough question. I never believe there's one root to any problem. I think we human beings are just too complicated and complex for that. I think it has much to do with unregulated greed, with a willful blindness to other people's humanity, and a deliberate ignorance to justify material interest, psychic status, and some sense of being better than others before one meets the worms, before one dies. So there's fears, anxieties, and insecurities in all of us in our move from womb to tomb. And what form it takes can be that kind of greed, that kind of ignorance, that kind of blindness. That's the kind of idolatries I was talking about when I talked about there is no God but Allah. Thou shalt worship no other gods before me. And colonialism in the modern period, especially tied to predatory capitalism, is a crucial, fundamental factor, but it's not the only factor. That would be my answer to you. So we can't tell a story about white supremacy and what we're talking about in terms of perception of Black people and brown people, indigenous peoples, without talking about colonial expansion. In this case, in the matter of the Europeans, we go back to the Greeks. It could be Genghis Khan. It could be Cyrus the Great in Persia. There's a whole host of stories about we human beings involved in quest for expansion and incorporating colonies. But in the modern period, colonialism certainly is fundamental, but it's not the only one. You see, there's a mystery at the center of the human heart such that the kind of gratuitous violence that human beings engage in with one another cannot be reduced just solely to material interests or just solely to colonial expansion.
Mm. Well, we're hitting close to the end, and so I wanted just to give Dr. Rose and Professor Stoughton a few seconds to give a short final reflection, and we'll be putting up a survey. We encourage all of our participants to fill that out. Dr. Rose, you first.
I want to just thank everyone for such a rich conversation and really an inspiring tone and spirit of conversation. It's not just about the content that I think has been so powerful, but it's really the tone that's been set, which is what will carry us through, right? Because we're just chipping away at a massive set of issues. And so it's going to be how we work together, how we think together, how we imagine what's possible, and how we care for each other with our words and our spirit that will really be the test of our success. So I just want to share that I've had a wonderful experience, and that I'm very grateful for having been in conversation.
Well, we're grateful to have you and Dr. West, and I think this is a good enough time as any to plug in your podcast, The Tightrope, which I've been enjoying. It was recently launched. I encourage everyone to listen to it. Amazing content. Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for joining, Dr. West as well. Professor Stoughton?
And thank you again for having me. It is an incredible honor to be included with the luminaries on this panel and in this conversation. And as you can imagine, I've been doing conversations like this for a while. This one seems very different. The spirit of the conversation, the questions being based in that hope and optimism instead of outrage. And I think there is room and reason for outrage here, but I also think there is room and reason for optimism. And when I see the sheer number of people and the spirit that they bring and the engagement in an event like this, it gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And I can't speak for anyone else, but that hope is what I need to avoid that outrage just giving rise to resignation. I think it's very easy to look at the history of policing, as I do as a policing scholar, and say, man, we know what the mistakes are. We've seen them repeated over and over and over again in the 1960s, during Prohibition, in the 1920s, in the post-Reconstruction era, in the origination of policing in this country in the 1840s. Why do we keep making the same mistakes? And it's enough to make me very pessimistic sometimes, but events like this restore my optimism. So on a very personal level, I thank you and the other panelists and all of the attendees for helping me see that there is a brighter future. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Professor Stoughton. We really appreciate you coming here and your scholarship and your rigorous work on the subject as well. Dr. West, final thoughts here?
I think Sister Rose and Brother Stoughton have said all that needs to be said. It has been so very rich. It uplifted my soul, and it allowed us to look unflinchingly at the ugliness, even as we refortify and rededicate ourselves in the quest for the beauty, the justice, the goodness, the truth, maybe even the holy for those of us who are tied to a God. Makes a difference in our lives.
Thank you for that. We also thank Chief Best, who had to leave, and she was very generous with her time with so much going on in Seattle. We appreciate her and her leadership. Mahershala, I'll turn it over to you for your final thoughts before we wrap up here.
I'm just so grateful for everyone coming and bringing their expertise, their thoughts, their opinions and presence to the discussion. I just feel blessed to learn and have the opportunity to use whatever platform I have in my affiliations to help push the conversation forward. And so thank you for being allies in this conversation.
Thank you, everyone. We look forward to a future parts with the Supreme Justice virtual series. I'm going to ask the organizers to put up a quick survey, if you could take a look at it, and we'll bid you a good evening. Stay blessed, and we hope and pray that everyone perseveres during these very difficult times. appreciate you responding to the survey before you leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.